Thanks, Allie. Good morning. Hi, Aaron. It's good to see you this morning. Happy Easter. Yesterday morning felt like Easter to me, that weather, and then we kind of got the gloom this morning. It's still Happy Easter, a little bit of the gloom, so April Fool's Day. Easter was yesterday. You missed it. No. Actually, I was reading an article on like how to April Fools prank your kids on Easter. There's a whole bunch of ideas, including like just tell them that you've hidden all the eggs out in the yard and just let them go and not have hidden a single egg. And just watch them look for eggs for 15 minutes and be like, April Fools, like the easiest prank ever. So you're welcome. Now you can prank your kids. My name is Adam, and I'm one of the pastors here, and glad that you've come to join us this morning for Easter. There's a lot of reasons why you may find yourself in this room this morning. Maybe this is where you worship every Sunday morning or most Sunday mornings, or maybe you've been dragged here by your family, which is okay too, or maybe you're here because you believe, or maybe you sit here this morning a bit of a skeptic, which is okay too. No matter how you ended up here this morning, we'd like you to know that we're glad that you're here. This morning is different from all other mornings in that it's a day we set aside to remember and celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And yet, in many ways, it's no different from any other Sunday morning. Because as Christians, we worship on Sundays because it's Resurrection Day. And so in effect, each Sunday for us is a little Easter, a remembrance that Jesus has conquered death for us. But there's something intensely focused about Easter Sunday morning. Many of you have been walking through with us here at Union Chapel through a really intentional season of Lent towards Easter. Maybe you've immersed yourself in Scripture, or you've been fasting, or setting aside money for sacrificial giving. And so you've come this morning in having anticipated this day for the last 40 days, which really makes this a sweet day. I am married to my wife. Her name, because that's probably a good thing. Her name is Emily. We have 2 kids. Ruby is 4, almost 5, and Cal is 3, just turned 3 in February. And so we have our hands full, but last night we decided it just felt like we needed to, like the sun was shining, and like we needed to go find a patio somewhere and eat dinner together in the sunshine, which is what we did. And we went to Lebanese. I don't know, it just felt like Middle Eastern food, like Holy Week, like just got to have some falafel or something, some hummus. And so that's what we did. And we're halfway through dinner, and my daughter Ruby says, "Wait! Everybody stop." And she's in this place where she just loves to stop and get everybody's attention. She, just, even if she doesn't have a reason. And so sometimes like we'll all stop what we're doing and give her attention. And then she'll be like, that kind of awkward. Like I didn't really know what I wanted to say. But this time she had something to say. She's like, "Wait, everybody stop. We forgot why we're even having dinner." And I was like, "Why is that?" And she's like, "God's risen." And we got a good chuckle out of that. God's risen. And even for Ruby, in her little 4-year-old mind, she's anticipating something this morning. She's anticipating something today. God's risen. He's awoke. He's arised. However you want to say it. However our small minds want to try and describe it, there's something miraculous, something essential, something that speaks to our hearts and causes us to come alive like a spring morning. So this morning I want to take a look at the account of the resurrection through the lens of John's gospel really quickly, and just a couple observations. There's a lot of accounts of Jesus and people encountering Jesus after his resurrection, and actually over the next 6 weeks we're going to be looking at some of those resurrection stories, a season that's typically set aside as Eastertide. a lot of times evangelical churches like celebrate Easter, it's a one-day shot and then we're done. But the church for ages and ages and ages has set aside 50 days to celebrate Easter. And so we're going to linger here. We're going to linger on these stories and what resurrection means for us, and would invite you to join us as we do that in the coming 6 weeks. So John's Gospel, or Gon's Gospel, we're going to be reading the 20th chapter, verses 1 through 18. You can read along in your Bibles or your app or on the screen. John chapter 20, verses 1 through 18. Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." So Peter went out with the other disciple, and they were going toward the tomb. Both of them were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. And stooping to look in, he saw the linen cloth lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths lying there, and the face cloth which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to their homes. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. As she wept, she stooped to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white, sitting where the body of Jesus had lain, one at the head and one at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." Having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord," and that he had said these things to her. I don't know what some of your favorite stories are. For me, bit of a nerd, but Lord of the Rings ranks fairly high on my list of stories that I like. And every couple of years, I'll go back and just watch. I'll watch the movies, and occasionally read the books, which take a little bit longer than watching the movies. Although watching the movies takes it's a commitment. If your director's cutting it, it's going to take you a while. But I'll go back, and my wife loves this. Whenever I go back and do this, she's just super excited, yay, we're going to watch Lord of the Rings for 15 hours. But we do it anyways, or she does something else, to Twitter or Instagram or something. But I will immerse myself in this story. Pinterest, that's what I meant to say. I will immerse myself in this story, and I think I love the story because it exists on this epic scale. It's a whole entire world and creatures and languages and cultures, and yet there's this massive struggle that's happening on this gigantic, epic scale. And who doesn't love to be drawn into an epic story? And yet there is something about the story that draws us in as well. There's a smallness to the story. You'll be seeing these massive fighting scenes and wars and orcs and battle sieges and all this stuff, and then it will just cut away to these two little hobbits where something amazing is happening, but it's very small. It seems very insignificant. The best stories create a landscape, a narrative that's epic in scale. And yet, we love to see a story of personal struggle, the way that one person is struggling to find their way through. John, in his gospel, I believe, is a master storyteller, and he's doing the same thing here. And at a first read through, it might seem like this is just an ordinary story. He's telling this very plainly. He doesn't tell it with a lot of drama or craziness. In fact, some of the other gospel writers do it with a lot more flair, earthquakes and all kinds of stuff going on. And John seems to just kind of tell it very plainly. But John is telling a huge story, is just hidden in some Easter eggs. You know what an Easter egg is? Like in a movie, have you ever heard that term? Okay, I'm going to educate you if you've never heard the term Easter egg. That in a movie or a video game, oftentimes creators will hide what they call an Easter egg, something where maybe it's an inside joke or it's something that gives deeper meaning to what's actually happening in this moment. Disney and Pixar love to hide little Easter eggs in their films as a way of saying there's something else going on here. I think if you go look up like famous Easter eggs in movies, you'll realize that there's a whole scene in Toy Story that's modeled after The Shining, which is really kind of freaky. Like the carpet's the same and a bunch of other stuff like that. And so what am I saying here? John has hidden some Easter eggs for us that are going to tell us about something amazing that's actually taking place on a grand scale here. So the first Easter egg this morning. John starts his gospel with what words? In the beginning. John begins his gospel with the same words that start the scriptures. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning. John does the same thing, which should immediately draw us back to the beginning of the story. Sure, he's going to tell us about Jesus of Nazareth, but he's wanting us to see a much larger story that's playing out. His whole gospel is actually going to be about a new creation story that's happening. One of the other Easter eggs we find is actually in chapter 19, where Jesus is taken by Pilate, and Pilate's had him flogged, and he brings Jesus back before the people. And he holds them up in front of the people, and he says, Ecce homo, which means behold the man. Behold the man. So if we're thinking about this in terms of creation, what day is it in the week? It's the sixth day. It's the sixth day of the week, the same day of the week in the Genesis story when God created man. And here's Pilate. And John's the only one who records this part. Pilate brings him before the people and says, behold the man. Jesus is crucified on that sixth day. And then what happens? He's buried. And on the seventh day, he lays in a tomb. On the seventh day, he lays in a tomb. On the seventh day, God rested. It was the Sabbath. And then we pick up in chapter 20, and John's first words are these words here. Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark. There's a lot of significance here. The first day of the week, a first day of a new creation. Seventh day, God rested. And Mary comes in the morning of that first day. John points this out twice in his gospel. He points out that it's the first day. Something new is happening here. And Mary Magdalene arrives when it's still dark. The sun hasn't come up yet. Darkness still covers the world. There's no hope. And they come and they find an empty tomb. And Mary runs back and gets Peter and John. And I love that John never mentions himself by name, but he's sure to mention that he's a faster runner than Peter, that he got to the tomb first. And they find this strange sight, that the body's gone and the clothes are folded up and left there. How many of you have ever had your house broken into to find that the thieves had made your bed and put the dishes in the dishwasher? They came expecting to see a crime scene and instead find something very different, something peculiar. And then Peter and John head back to their houses, and Mary stays there weeping. And when Jesus appears to her, John tells us that she doesn't recognize him at first. She mistakes him for the gardener. I love this little Easter egg. the gardener. No one gives very much detail about the place where Jesus was buried. But this should perk our interest. Why on earth wouldn't John just say, she mistook him for somebody else? Like, that would make a whole lot more sense. But he's very careful to say, she mistook him for the gardener. If Mary thought that Jesus was the gardener, then that means that Jesus was likely buried in a garden. History begins. Creation begins in a garden. And now all history hangs on what God is doing here in this garden. All history is turning on this moment. And so it's actually quite hilarious that Mary thought he was the gardener, because he was. In some way, in some strange way, Jesus was the gardener. You think about Adam's vocation. The first man's vocation was to be a gardener. Which is what? To live in God's good world, to take care of it, to reign over it. But that whole endeavor gets screwed up pretty fast. And subsequently, every human ever since has decided they were better off without God on this whole ruling endeavor. And so John opens up this narrative, this story, by giving us these clues that tell us something much larger is happening here. We're back in the garden. In one moment, we're transported in a backflash to the garden and the man and that failed attempt. And now we stand in a new garden, in a new day, a new first day, and we see that this moment, this grand story is taking a decisive turn. All was not lost in that first garden, yet there has been much pain and toil and tears. But here on this first day, we witness a turn toward hope and something much better. A first day in a new world. And John doesn't want us to miss, he's giving us these clues because he doesn't want us to miss the fact that resurrection has grand narrative consequences. We'll never understand the personal significance of the gospel if we don't understand the big picture. That Jesus came not to condemn the world, but to save it. The world, to save it. In the resurrection of Jesus, we have the first of a new creation where God has come in flesh and blood to rescue and ransom and restore the whole of creation. So good stories draw us into this epic narrative, and it may not look like it on the outside, but John's actually telling a massive story. But good stories always find a way of telling us who we are. They have a way of drawing us into the smallness as well. And John does this really well by telling us the story of Mary. Mary Magdalene. In all four gospel accounts, Mary is the one credited with being the first person to see the resurrected Christ. John doesn't say much about her, but in the other Gospels we get some details on who Mary is, and that she's a woman who Jesus cast out 7 demons from. So not the most credible witness. If you're writing the historical account of Jesus and knew that for all history this fact would be questioned, who would make this a part of their story? In fact, many people find this to be the most helpful thing for skeptics. Say, what other reason could you give for all 4 people in that day and age, in that time when a woman's witness was not worth anything, for all 4 of them to say that she was the first one? The only reason you might include that detail is because it was true. N.T. Wright says in his commentary, if someone in the first century had wanted to invent a story about people seeing Jesus, they wouldn't have dreamed of giving the star part to a woman, let alone Mary Magdalene. So here she is. She's come and she's found the tomb empty while it's still dark, and then she goes and she gets the disciples, and then they come and then they peek inside. It says John believes, but they don't see anything other than the linens wrapped up, and then Peter and John go back, and she stays. She stays, and there's a weightiness to this moment. They go back home. They've seen what they need to see, and yet Mary stays and she weeps. This word, she stayed, should kind of remind us the sense of abiding. That she just couldn't she had nowhere else to go. And so she stayed at the empty tomb. It's a scene we've seen played out 1,000 times. Even this week, as I read a story of bloodshed again in the Middle East, in Gaza, and you see women holding the bodies of their young sons and they're weeping. And they keep weeping, and it's a story we've seen played over and over and over again. Here's a woman who laid all her hopes on Jesus. And then all of her hopes were killed and buried in a tomb. And now she's come to just weep and mourn over her hope that is gone, and they've even taken away the body. She doesn't even have a body. She doesn't even have anywhere to place her grief or her sadness. They've taken that too. Mary has nowhere else to go. She has nowhere she wants to go. And so we see her going back again to the tomb, which is this amazing. How many times has Mary poked her head in the tomb now? Assuming she did it the first time, and then she did it again, maybe with Peter and John, and now here she is again, looking back, this sense of abiding, like she can't wrap her mind around what's going on. And so she steps back into the tomb one more time, and what does she see? She sees two angels who weren't there for Peter and John. Bummer. Sorry, guys, you missed out. One author said, maybe angels have to be seen through tears. Most of the time in the scriptures when angels show up, people are terrified. But Mary she doesn't skip a beat. It's not like, and she was afraid. Nope. She's just locked on to her grief and her sadness. She's too overcome to be afraid. And the angels ask why she's crying. And she utters words here that echo the entire human condition. They've taken him away. This is the man who found her. Jesus is the man who found her in her madness. The pictures we get in the scriptures of demon-possessed people aren't great. They're often dirty, half-clothed, or naked, and utter outcasts of the society. And at one point, Jesus casts the demons out of her and restores her life and restores her to community. And she's placed all of her hopes in him. You can hear the echoes of her grief in these words. They've taken him. You can hear it echo out. My son, my daughter, they took him from me. My house, my belongings, my rights, my dignity, my hopes, my life, they've taken it from me. The world's grief is concentrated right here in Mary's tears. And what's the answer to her grief? She turns around and sees a strange figure. Who is he? What's he doing? He must be the gardener. He isn't, and he is. And Jesus, in this intensely personal moment, says this. He says, woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking? It's a greeting and a consolation and a gentle rebuke and an invitation all wrapped into one. Why are you weeping? Who are you looking for? Come on, don't you know me? Open your eyes. And then it says, and supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've laid him, and I will take him away. Here, even in the face of the risen Christ, she's still lost, completely lost in her grief. So much so that she's staring in his face, asking him if he's the one who took Jesus' body. Did you take him? I don't know who you are, but did you take him? Where have you taken him? Tell me where you've laid him so that I know where to lay my grief. And then Jesus says this. Jesus said to her, Mary. Jesus speaks her name, Miriam. That's all he says. And she turns, and in the second that it takes her to turn, the whole of human history is turning with her. It's this massive, epic, grand story, and yet it's so personal. This is where God shows up, not in temple courts, not in stadiums, not with the important government figures of the day. No, here, with the formerly demon-possessed woman who's weeping, he shows up. The good shepherd knows his sheep, and he calls them by name. And Mary hears her name, and she knows that voice. Tim Keller says this. He says, Jesus chose a reformed mental patient, not a pillar of the community, chose one of the support team, not one of the leaders to be the first Christian. How much clearer can he be? He's saying, it doesn't matter who you are or what you've done. My salvation and grace is not based on pedigree. It's not based on moral attainments, raw talents, level of effort, or track record. I have come to call those who are weak. And so this friend who is in utter grief is the first to see the beginning of the restoration of heaven and earth, and it begins with Jesus saying her name. Real faith is always personal. If you only believe that Jesus is a good guy or a moral teacher, or that he died to forgive people in general for their sins, you don't believe that Jesus died for you. You haven't taken a hold of Jesus by faith. You haven't heard him call your name. This is amazing to me. He's done all this hard work of passing all the way through his suffering and death and passing all the way through that into his resurrection. And he returns in mercy to speak the name of his friend. He says, Mary. It doesn't end there. He says, Mary, don't cling to me, which is a really interesting thing to say. But I think it's this, Mary, something's changed. And you can't hang on to me the way you've hung on to me before. It's going to be the same, but it's going to be really different too. And so you can't hold on to me. He says, Mary, go to my brothers and say to them, I think I have this part too. Go to my brothers and say to them, I'm ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and to your God. Mary, I know you want to stay here, but things are different now. The force of this statement is something to behold when you slow down for a minute. Jesus all this time has called them disciples, servants, friends. Do you see the massive shift? Go and tell my brothers. Go and tell them that I'm ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Jesus all this time has referred to God as the Father or my Father, but now it shifts. He's my Father and he's your Father. And you're not just disciples and friends and servants, you're my brothers. Something new has happened here. The relationship of man to God has fundamentally changed. We're no longer servants and disciples and just friends. We are brothers and co-heirs. And we can live in this same space of relating to the Father in the same way that Jesus has related to him this whole time. Mary, go and tell them that I'm alive, and tell them that it's different now. And he sends this woman who is now the very first Christian and the very first apostle to the apostles. Like, it just blows my mind that he lifts her up. Like, how far has Mary come? Because of Jesus' love. Because he called her out away from the demon possession, and now he's called her name again, and now he's sending her as the very first one to go and tell. So just a couple of closing thoughts here. A couple words of encouragement. I think sometimes we can believe that Jesus came for us, but we forget that he came for all of it. We can get so zeroed in on Jesus' love for us that we forget that he came for the big picture. Jesus' resurrection is a cosmic shift, a new creation. And it's not a creation where God has scrapped everything and burned it and is starting over. No, he's taking the raw materials of all of the darkness and sin and suffering that sin and darkness has caused, and he enters into it and he sanctifies it and he makes it holy through his death and resurrection. He's conquered death by going through it, and he made a new creation out of the old one. On a cosmic level, this is what Jesus is doing. He isn't coming to make all new things. He's coming to make all things new. I think sometimes we can get in this space in terms of our Christianity that we think this is just about how God has loved me and I'm just kind of hanging out waiting for him to take me home because he's going to burn all of this. And that's not the story. That's not the story we believe. The story we believe is that God isn't coming to make all new things. He's coming to make all things new again. This means that the work that Jesus is calling us to is here and now. It isn't a wait it out until he burns it all down and starts over. It's about doing what he's done, taking the materials at hand and fashioning something new with him. Just take a moment. What's around you? Your vocation, your home, your messy family. He isn't calling you out of those things. He's sending you straight back into the middle of them. And he's saying, come and garden with me. We're going to make all things new. It's a new day. He hasn't just come for you. He's come for all of it. Maybe your picture of Jesus and the resurrection has been too small, and you need to open your eyes to the resurrection work that God is doing every day all around you. Second, it's just the flip side of that. Jesus in his resurrection hasn't just come for all of it. He's come for you. Sometimes it's easier to stand at a distance and just believe the big story and say, yep, looks good. The personal is too painful. The grief is too much to bear. They've taken him. And I don't want to hope again because every time I hope, my hopes get dashed on the rocks of my life. It's just easier to keep this faith thing at a distance where I can look at it and kind of judge it, and I don't have to enter into it in any way. But this is the good news of Easter morning, that Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, has come to speak your name. Can you imagine that? Just for a moment with me. Imagine yourself in that place. You've got to close your eyes. Imagine in all your grief being in that garden. And seeing the empty tomb and just needing somewhere to lay your grief. And you hear him call your name. And you feel him grab your arm and turn you around and look you in the eye. And speak your name. That's the tricky part, right? When you try and imagine that moment, you're not imagining some beliefs or doctrines. Those don't save you. Grace and mercy and salvation have come for you today in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and he is here speaking your name. He hasn't just come for the world, he's come for you. That's the invitation today. To come and receive Jesus. To come and respond to him calling your name. So that's what I want to invite you to this morning. Whether you're responding for the 100th or 1,000th time or the first time. We celebrate this meal every single week. We celebrate the meal that Jesus left us with, where he broke the bread and he said, this is my body broken for you. The bread of life. Here, my body to sustain you in your living. And then he gave us the wine, and he said, drink this. This is my blood. A new covenant, a sign of a new covenant, a new thing that God is doing. And it's going to be signed and sealed with my blood. And so I want you to take these things. We do. We come and we receive this every single week. And this morning is no different for us. We come and we eat this bread and we drink this wine and we receive the invitation into something new. And so the invitation this morning is to come and worship, to lift your voices, to sing. Come to the table and rejoice and have your fill. Amen? Let's pray. Lord, we are humbled this morning at the sight of the empty tomb, that you have come for all of it, and you have come for us. So this morning, I pray that your Spirit would come and find us wherever we're at. That you would come and you would speak our names once again, that you would restore us to you, that deep in our hearts we would know that we would experience again fresh, anew this morning, that you've taken our grief, that you've taken our sadness, and that you're calling us back into the world with you to be a part of this new work that you're doing. You're sending us. Jesus, we love you and we lay these things at your feet. Amen.